Dear audience, my name is Dagmar Droogsma and I welcome you to this event, which is part of the European Union side events at COP26. We will be discussing climate mitigation for EU and global shipping. This is a very important discussion, as we know that if we don't take action to reduce the emissions from shipping, they will increase dramatically by 2050. And various ways of how to reduce emissions are being discussed at the international level, through the International Maritime Organization, and in the EU as part of the measures that will lead Rein. And after their presentation, we'll have a panel discussion that also includes Lasse Christoffersen and Michael Maas. After the panel discussion, you will be able to ask questions, and please do use Slido for that. On the screen, you can see a red button, and you click on that, you can ask your questions. So without further delay, we go straight to our first presenter, which is Panos Spiliotis. Panos is a colleague of mine in the Environmental Defence Fund Europe, based in Brussels, and he is our global shipping manager. He is an EU transport policy expert and who is focused on climate mitigation in the shipping sector. Before he joined our organization, Panos worked in several EU roles, including for a member of the European Parliament in the Transport and Tourism Committee of the European Parliament, and also for the Airports Council International Europe. Panos, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dagmar. And good morning, everyone. Maybe a brief word on the Environmental Defence Fund. Environmental Defence Fund's mission. Next slide, please. Thank you. Environmental Defence Fund's mission is to preserve natural systems through sound science and economics. If you're in Glasgow, you may have seen EDF already in various fora, like the Methane Pavilion and the Nature Pavilion already. Next slide, please. EDF has been an advocate of climate action in shipping for several years. Our work has looked at the potential of zero carbon fuels, but also has included things like legal research around what form solutions can take at IMO, as well as what we can learn from the experience of ICAO and aviation. Most recently, we conducted an assessment of China's Belt and Road Initiative when it comes to green shipping, and that's identified several shipping decarbonization opportunities. Next slide, please. So on the main subject of today, the reason why we're in this event, global shipping has a large and growing impact on climate. It is responsible for almost 3% of global greenhouse gases, which is about the same as Germany. It is also growing, and that's an important component to take into account. Alongside carbon, shipping is also responsible for growing emissions of methane, and this is due. Okay, and what can we do about this? I mean, as an aside, of course, the demand for shipping is derived from demand for global trade. And so shipping also responds to developments in global trade. So perhaps as we optimize our trade patterns, taking into account climate, there will also be an impact on shipping's emissions. But here we very much focus on what we can do to transition the sector itself and its own impact on climate. So traditionally, shipping is seen as a hard to abate sector. We talk about electrifying everything a lot these days, and I think it's being heard also at COP. But unfortunately, this doesn't really apply to a lot of the vessels that we're looking at in shipping. You can't really electrify a large ocean-going vessel. But that's not to say that we cannot decarbonize shipping. To start off, upgrading and retrofitting ships, harnessing wind power, optimizing ships' speeds. For all these things, we can actually achieve considerable emissions reductions this decade. IMO research shows, and this is what the graph next to the bullets is about, that efficiency measures offering up to 20% emissions reductions actually have a positive return on investment for industry. And they're only held back by market barriers. And this is quite an incredible opportunity, really. This is how I think we should be looking at these efficiency opportunities. Beyond this decade, and to eliminate greenhouse gas emissions altogether from shipping, the sector absolutely must switch to zero carbon fuels. Next slide, please. Timing is key. The sooner that emissions reductions begin, the longer the industry's transition to zero carbon fuels can be, while staying on course to meet the Paris Agreement. So if we start now, and that's illustrated by the blue line, the climate benefits of retrofitting and the efficiencies that I mentioned can actually buy the sector valuable time. Then the global shipping industry has a decarbonization pathway that stretches out to 2045 or longer, which is a timeline that is credible to turn around a global sector. But the time to start emissions reductions is now. Next slide, please. Okay, emissions reductions won't happen without regulation. There's a lot of ambition in industry, and I think in this event we'll hear some of that ambition, but regulation has to play a central role. And the IMO is the only agency with the power to implement truly global shipping regulations. Unfortunately, the IMO has a mixed track record when it comes to climate specifically so far. And this has led some to question how central it can be to shipping's transition going forward. Our message is that we cannot really afford to lose hope in the IMO. A well-designed carbon levy, which is an instrument that's being discussed there, with global applicability, would have an immediate and powerful effect on transition. Next slide, please. But since we're in the EU pavilion this morning, let's focus a little bit more on the EU. The European region is without a doubt setting the pace in climate policy for the shipping sector. And that's with its July package of this year, so Fit for 55 package that was part of the European Green Deal. So this included proposals to extend the emissions trading scheme, so Europe's cap and trade scheme, also to the shipping sector. It included a fuel standard that's known as Fuel EU Maritime, and an infrastructure regulation, so the alternative fuels infrastructure regulation. This European basket of measures will also hopefully push IMO in the direction of more climate action, especially since MEPC 77 begins in about 10 days' time. Next slide, please. Okay, so among these three EU policies, it is the ETS that has attracted most attention so far. Putting a price on carbon is a good first step, but it will have to be ambitious enough for emissions reductions to begin in the 2020s, so this decade, to make the timeline that I showed earlier feasible. To achieve this, the EU could have to extend to a full scope, full MRV scope as it's called, or perhaps to set additional ETS requirements on shipping, or for ambitious EU states to make use of new opportunities in things like marine fuel tax that are also opening up through the European Green Deal. When it comes to fuels, the Commission has proposed a fuel standard, which it has also submitted to IMO. These instruments have a role to play alongside carbon pricing, but they shouldn't promote one fossil fuel in the place of another. We don't think that LNG offers a credible solution to shipping's climate problem. Fuel standards should promote zero carbon e-fuels, such as green hydrogen, for example, or green ammonia, and wind power, which has a role to play as well. Finally, seaports must transform along with the vessels on this journey, on the journey of decarbonization. And the EU can and must go further in reimagining the role that seaports can play in the zero carbon shipping. Next slide, please. So in summary, shipping emissions will double by 2050 under business as usual if we don't do anything, and must come to a declining trajectory as soon as possible. Efficiency upgrades, slow operating speeds for ships are essential for the near-term greenhouse gas reduction that we need to see. And in the medium to long run, we must do a lot more to get zero carbon fuels adopted with a minimum of 5% by 2030. And we also find EU and IMO to be working in synergy. Strong EU measures can accelerate IMO's pace, but both must be agreed as soon as possible if 1.5 degree trajectories can remain within reach for this sector and more generally, of course. Next slide. Well, that's pretty much it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Panos. And you covered a lot of ground, both at an IMO international perspective and also the EU. And I can imagine that the audience has some questions. So please feel free to already add them to Slido so that at the end of the session, they can be addressed. So we now go to the second presentation, which is from Peter Rein, and he will talk about partnerships to address climate change and development in voluntary carbon markets. Peter is the chairman of the board of directors of the Foundation Development and Climate Alliance. He's a political scientist and he has been working in leading positions with Assistance and Development Cooperation for almost 30 years. He therefore has an extensive experience throughout the world on these issues. He's very knowledgeable about current challenges in the field of development cooperation and climate policy. And since 2020, he has been chairman of the board of directors from the Foundation Development and Climate Alliance. So please, Peter, your time.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and a warm welcome also from my side. And thank you, Dagmar, for your kind introduction. And also thank you, Panos, for your great insights. My name, as Dagmar already said, is Peter Rein, and I'm speaking as the chairman of the German Foundation Development and Climate Alliance. I will very briefly explain to you the context in which we operate and what the foundation is all about. Maybe go to slide 2, please. As we all now, and just heard again from Panos again, as of now, the world is definitely not on a 1.5 degree path to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. In fact, we are far away from it. And as we have to cut emissions by half until 2030 to meet the 1.5 degree goal. The emissions gap by 2030 with a view to Paris target is around 30 billion tons carbon equivalent. The current status, as we learned in the middle of this week, is that according to Climate Action Tracer, the world is currently on a 2.4 degree track with a view to 2030. If we go to slide 3, please. So in fact, we all have to do more. Panos said it for the shipping industry. And I would like to talk to you rather about a part of the solution than further dwelling on the problem that is all too well known for us. Our alliance promotes high quality voluntary carbon offsetting in addition to avoidance and mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions. We think that exceeding climate compliance, even more can be done beyond government measures. The potential of this path is massive. In 2018, just and only 2.5% of emissions in Germany were offset. Our platform gives access to various carbon offset projects that meet the highest certification standards. And this is, ladies and gentlemen, the important message. We are talking about voluntary, high quality following standards offsetting projects embedded in a strategy of avoidance and mitigations. Our supporters, companies, institutions, and these are companies, for example, shareholding companies, multinational concerns, as well as small and medium-sized companies, institutions, as I said, and private individuals, promote sustainable projects in emerging and developing countries and thereby actively improve their carbon offsetting. This enables them to reach climate neutrality faster and promote the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And this, ladies and gentlemen, and if we can go to slide 4, please, leads us to the SDGs. On the 2030 agenda, here, 1/3 of the implementation period has already passed. And the world is, and this is also discussed on COP here in Glasgow more than one time, the world is not on track to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. In addition, the COVID-19 pandemic has dramatically slowed down development in certain fields. But we just will be successful in fight against climate change if the Agenda 2030 and the Paris Agreement can achieve together. This is what we have to fight for, ladies and gentlemen. Next slide, please. So high integrity for climate and development. This is what we are for. We are promoting high integrity of climate and development projects, and our partners are required to follow strict listening criteria and encouraged to follow the highest certification standards as regards to sustainable development. The supporters are encouraged to have their own science-based net zero strategy, and offsetting, voluntary offsetting, as I already said now, following the highest standards, must follow high quality with leverage sustainable development in countries of the global south. This in combination is the way to do from our point of view. So if we move to slide 6, please. What is the foundation's contribution? To date, we have more than 1,200 supporters and close to 30 offsetting partners in our multi-actor partnership. The effect is significant. Our supporters have offset more than 3.6 million tons of carbon equivalents in the year 2020. This is more than 10% of the entire German voluntary carbon market. And as I said at earlier stage, there is a lot which can be done more. So, next slide, please. At this point, I would like to thank you, all of you, very much to give room, and now to give the room to our friend and the famous skipper Boris Hammond, which finished as 5th the Vendée Globe at the beginning of this year, just as impressive in his contribution for climate science and the high seas and the education program which is connected to that. A short video illustrates the impact that Boris and his team makes. And he was able to do this, and we were very proud that he took our logo as well, also by supporting of Kühne und Nagel. So thank you very much once more, and I may hand over to Dagmar, and please show us the video.
Wir nehmen mit Team Malizia an den härtesten Segelrennen der Welt teil. Wir wollen als Team nicht nur schnell segeln, wir haben auch eine Botschaft. Segeln ist ein unglaubliches Symbol für die Kraft der Natur. Daher wollen wir die große Medienaufmerksamkeit in die Regatten nutzen, um für Nachhaltigkeit und Klimaschutz zu werben. Die Ankunft mit Greta Thunberg in New York war das weltweit größte Medienereignis in der Geschichte der Nachhaltigkeitsziele der Vereinten Nationen.
Wir sitzen alle in einem Boot und uns ist es ein Anliegen, Kinder für den Klimawandel, für den Klimaschutz und das Thema Ozean zu sensibilisieren und auch Achtsamkeit zu schaffen. Das von mir konzipierte Malizia-Schulprogramm wurde von Prinz Albert II. Preisgekrönt und wir konnten bereits mehrere tausend Kinder weltweit mit diesem Programm erreichen und begeistern. Über die spannenden Segelabenteuer der Malizia schaffen wir einen Zugang und stiften Motivation, sodass Kinder mit Begeisterung mehr über den Ozean und den Klimawandel lernen möchten.
Es gibt sehr, sehr wenige Forschungsschiffe, wenn man sich überlegt, wie groß der Ozean ist. Und da kommt die Malizia ins Spiel, weil Boris segelt über die Weltmeere und kann nebenbei auch noch sehr, sehr wichtige Daten für uns erheben. Das ist der Sensor oder das Messgerät und das misst das CO2, damit wir auch sagen können, wie ändert sich das Klima, warum hat unser menschliches Handeln Auswirkungen auf den Ozean und wie sieht das aus und wie wird das vielleicht in der Zukunft sein.
Beim Thema Nachhaltigkeit sitzen wir alle in einem Boot. Die Zeit läuft. Kommt mit an Bord bei Team Malizia, dem heute bekanntesten Team, das für Nachhaltigkeit steht. Lasst uns das Rennen gewinnen.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you for the video. I can imagine that the audience may also be interested to hear about some of the projects your organization is doing that relate to shipping offsetting. So when we come back to the panel, there may be some questions about that. So after these two presentations, we will now move to the panel discussion. And besides panels and Peter, I would like to introduce to you two panel members who come from slightly different parts of the industry. First, Lasse Christoffersen. He is the president and CEO of Torvald Klaveness. And Lasse, I hope I pronounced that correctly. And for those of you in the audience who are from outside Europe, Torvald Klaveness is a Norwegian shipping company with a very ambitious track record on climate issues. Lasse started in the company in 2007, and in 2011 he was appointed the Chief Executive Officer for Torvald Klaveness. Prior to that, Lasse worked for 11 years for Det Norske Veritas in various positions, including 2 years in New York, starting up Maritime Solutions Americas. And in 2006, he became director of the Operation DNV Industry Norge. Now, Lasse, I probably pronounce all those things incorrectly, but I think the message is clear. You have a long track record in the shipping industry, and therefore you're a very valuable panel member for this discussion. The second panel member that is now also joining is Michael Maas. He's the Vice President Sustainable Solutions of Kühne Nagel. And for those of you who are not familiar with the European market, Kühne Nagel is a global logistic firm. They are freight forwarders and thus have a huge interest in the shipping discussion. Michael started his shipping career in 1982 with Hapag-Lloyd. And in 2006, he joined Kühne Nagel as a trade manager for the Northern Europe to Asia Pacific trades. Since 2019, Michael has been in charge of sustainability solutions for sea-related transport. And one of his main functions is to assist customers in the pursuit of transporting goods in an environmental friendly and sustainable manner. And again, I think your contribution to this discussion is incredibly important, Lasse, because it represents two parts of an industry, shipping itself, but also those who are dependent on shipping for moving goods around the world. So it's great to have you both here. And I take the liberty to put the first question to both Lasse and Michael. And I'd like to have your perspective on what do you see as the biggest challenge for reducing shipping emissions to net zero by 2050? And Lasse, can I perhaps start with you?
Certainly, and I'm happy to kick it off. And I think the basic answer to that is that the market will not solve it itself. And what do I mean by that? Well, as Pamela said earlier on, direct electrification of deep sea vessels, which are 80% of the emissions from shipping, is not possible. And just to prove that, we have vessels carrying 80,000 tons of cargo, and they have 3,000 tons of fuel. If we are to replace that fuel tank with Tesla batteries, the weight of those batteries will be 80,000 tons, as big as the vessel itself. The cost of those batteries will be $850 million, and the cost of the vessel is 50. So this tells you, even with a complete breakthrough in battery technology, direct electrification of shipping is not possible. So we need to go the way, but still the green electrons is what will decarbonize shipping as well, but we need to take the route through hydrogen, either in terms of ammonia or other applications. We could come back to that. And we know, even if you have free power, if electricity costs zero, and you add the full scale effect of cost reductions, we would not be even close to competitive on zero emission fuels versus carbon fuels. So that's why I'm saying the market will not solve it itself. For cars and for others, the electric cars are cheaper and better. In shipping, it's not. So that means that the market will not solve it, but on the other hand, the market is the most effective way to solve it. And that is why we are so focused on market-based mechanisms. We need to put the price on the stuff we don't like, CO2, enabling those stuff that we want to have, zero emission fuels. So that's really I think the setting for this discussion from my perspective.
Thank you, Lasse, and we'll go into further detail later, but I think that is a very clear vision on how you see things moving forward. Michael, what is your perspective on this question in terms of the biggest challenge for reducing shipping emissions?
Yeah, thanks, Dagmar, and hello to everybody. We as Kühne + Nagel, as already stated, are not a shipping line, but with approximately close to 5 million TEUs, which we ship around the globe on behalf of our customers. We are, of course, a very active player in the segment. I think the major challenge we are looking at is that we act in an industry which is to almost 100% still dependent on fossil fuels. And this is not going to change in the next couple of years. So we are looking here at a transition period, somewhere between 10 and 15 years probably, before these things will finally kick in on a larger scale. So I would say there are three major points to consider in this regard. It has been mentioned by Lasse already partly. The cost factor is, of course, something which is in the eyes of the hardware owners, in this regard, the shipping companies, a very important point, because it comes with, when we look at the entire industry, it comes with billions and billions of US dollars or euros to invest in order to create a new, more sustainable, or at the end of the day, zero emission fleet. Another challenge, that would be my second point, is of course the fact that while from a technology perspective, we have basically proved already that there are ways to achieve a zero emission vessel. But of course, if we talk about truly green vessels in future, we need to look at the subject of renewable energy. So this is going to be the supplying source for creating, and Panos had mentioned that already in the beginning, for creating so-called e-fuels, hydrogen-based fuels, be it ammonia, be it methanol, whatever. At the end of the day, when we talk about truly green shipping, it all has to be based upon this. And the third and last point I would like to raise is then, of course, the subject of cost, the subject of possible taxation, because at the end of the day, as we all know, this doesn't come for free. It comes with a big price tag. And this is why it's so important to find global solutions for this global challenge, i.e., we are talking here about political decisions. EU made a big step forward. IMO, as the global actor, is of course an organization which needs to pick up that pace actually in order to achieve terms and conditions which apply for everybody, because what is not to be forgotten, despite all our efforts in regards to sustainability, we in the shipping industry still act in a very, very competitive environment, and that is why it makes it so important to have equal terms being applicable to everybody out there, no matter where they sit.
Thank you, Michael. And the 3 points you mentioned are, I think, well known, but the answers to all of that are not there yet. So perhaps to go back to Lasse, as a CEO of a shipping company, what do you see specifically the way forward internationally, probably through IMO, but also in the EU and the role the EU can play in that? Panos referred to that a little bit in his presentation, but I'm really interested in your view.
Sure. I mean, in an ideal world, we all should decarbonize at the same pace and fast enough with international rules. That is not the situation. And that will not likely be the situation anytime soon, because IMO is not a body that decides individually. IMO is representation of 100 and something countries, all with different interests, and some win and some lose in this transition. That's why it's so difficult to make decisions there. So in my view, I think that, I mean, we should still fight for IMO to come up with regulations, but that will not kick off the transition, but that will be needed to globally scale the transition, certainly. So in my view, what EU has done is excellent. And I wouldn't have said this 2 years ago or 5 years ago, because I was still hoping for IMO, but that's not happening. So the fact that EU now put a price on emissions in shipping leaves the discussions for the rest of the world to say, not if we have a price on carbon, but where, how large it will be, and who will benefit from that price on carbon. And I think that changes the whole picture. And in all transitions, you see that it starts with pockets. So it also will be in shipping. And we heard this week at COP about green corridors, meaning that some customers will aggregate their demand, some suppliers their supply, and teaming up with some energy partners to create the first green corridors. And most likely, these will involve EU because you have a price on carbon quite soon. So I think, in my view, it's both a love and a hate relationship to regional regulations, but we are running out of time. We cannot wait for collective solutions only. We need to start locally, regionally, and each business, and that's what we see. And I think just the last comment to that, I think it's so important that we have a discussion on how we transform this industry, not just how we improve the industry, because this is not the question of blending in hydrogen or blending in ammonia. Either we have an infrastructure on carbon or we have an infrastructure on some vector of hydrogen, and you cannot use both. So we cannot decarbonize 50% by putting half of the fuel on board as zero emission. It doesn't work like it could do in cars and others. So this is a very important point. We need to work on how do we get to that transition point and transition to zero. And I would be happy to talk more about that, but I'm sure you want to move on.
Yeah, I'd like to move on, Lasse, but there's one thing I'd like to pick up on what you said, and you talked about green corridors, and I think the way I understand it is that you've got to start somewhere and others will build on that. This week, I was drawn to an initiative that is taking place in Scandinavia, and I don't know how big it is, you may know, but this is about an organization coming together and basically giving ratings to the sustainability of shippings that come into Scandinavian ports, so that freight forwarders like Michael's company actually almost have a choice. They could say, okay, this is a very dirty ship, I don't want to use them, and that is a very clean one. Do you think something like that has got a role to play as well, even though it may start small?
In the short term, it's about energy efficiency. How do you prioritize those vessels being more energy efficient? And then, of course, data transparency, and through that, improve decision-making among those who buy the services, that will help. But I think it's very important that that can only take us a little bit forward. That can only improve the technology stack we have. It will not change the technology stack. So I don't think it's bad. But what we have seen in Norway, and I think this is a very, very important point, a lot of people excuse themselves by saying, we don't know what the solutions are. There are no solutions yet. We don't know what to do, so we cannot do anything on zero. That's not correct. In Norway, we have, of course, as you might know, we have a lot of electrical ferries, proven, boom. We have ferries on hydrogen. We have now two companies came together and made a tender for a zero emission dry bulk vessel, a coastal vessel, by the way, on hydrogen. We have a offshore supply vessel is now converting into burning ammonia with fuel cells. So it's not a question of what the technologies or the fuels are and whether the technology is available, they are. It is a question of whether we are willing to deploy them at scale, short term, so we can develop the technology and the safety around them. And then secondly, scale it globally through global regulations. So the technologies, we have quite clear visibility to both the fuels and the technologies. And this is really why I believe that green corridors is not only something for the future, it's actually happening on a national level now, on a regional level soon, and on a global level, probably over the next 5 years or so.
Thank you, Lasse. And to bring in Michael's perspective, as a global logistic firm, you don't own ships. So, it'd be really interesting to hear, how do you see, well, from your perspective as a company, a logistic company, what is really most important in terms of tackling emissions from shipping? And also, how do you feel that you, as a freight forwarder, have you got an impact on that, you think?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Kuehne+Nagel as a logistics company, or as you call it, let's say the old-fashioned term of freight forwarder, which is now going way beyond actually, but I think we all know what is meant. As a logistics company, of course, we are somewhere between, like when we talk about shipping here, those companies like the shipping companies who own the vessels, and then the cargo owner. So basically, what is also my personal experience, because that is also part of my job to bring our net zero carbon initiatives forward to the market and to explain to customers, for instance, what is out there for them already today. Because as we already said and stated, there is no time to lose actually. And while we are not yet having these new technologies on a big scale, on these 20,000 TEU vessels, etc., we need to search for ways to act now already in order to have a positive impact. So what I usually start with is basically some kind of groundwork, because some people might be surprised. We are here obviously in a round of experts, and also our viewers are experts in most cases, I'm quite sure, but still at the end of the day, when you talk to one of these typical import-export medium-sized customers out there, they are not necessarily knowing all this stuff. So it's sometimes we are really sometimes starting from scratch, where we explain to clients how to calculate emissions, what is their status quo, what's the carbon footprint, and what is out there in terms of solutions. So I think what is not to be forgotten is that while we are responsible for a whole bunch of emissions created, still it is the backbone of the global trading. 90% of the goods imported, exported are shipped, and it is still 80 times more environmentally friendly than air freighting, for instance. So it is basically the sheer volume of goods that is transported, more than 150 million containers worldwide, that creates, of course, these emissions. And I think the good news here really is that maybe rather than the political decisions, which naturally take a lot of longer time from the business side, there are so many initiatives on the way already that I think we really are on the right track. And maybe just as a last side note on your question, Dagmar, I think it is also, you know, interesting to just think about that for a minute. When you have CEOs of the biggest shipping lines in the world appealing to the politicians to ensure that in terms of taxation, that we are getting some speed in order, you know, to have a solid base for all these investments which are going to come. Because at the end of the day, and I'm also very straightforward when speaking to customers about this, all these sustainability measures don't come for free. And at the end of the day, somebody has to pay for that, and somebody has to take a share for it. And we cannot leave the vessel owners alone with all this investment, basically. Again, we are talking about billions and billions of dollars. So it needs to have a solid basis, and not just an option to take or not to take, but we need to have a clear regulation on this.
And yeah, I think you make a very important point there, Michael. I mean, on the one hand, it's really good that you also bring in a positive note, and that there's a push from industry to see things differently. But the question about funding is perhaps a bit of an elephant in the room. What is your perspective on you know, what could be a solution for that big issue of how this will be funded? Have you got certain views on that?
It's of course a very complex subject, and I think one of the important points is to achieve transparency on the entire subject. Just to give you a very simple example, when we talk about our fossil fuels-based industry, the regular, let's say, bunker oil, you know, for the shipping industry, we have market index for this. We know what the regular bunker price is. So we know, for instance, about the index for biofuel, just to mention one example. Yeah? We don't have much alternatives out there on a bigger scale today. But you know, when we talk to customers, for instance, about making use of that option, which comes almost free of emissions, part of the truth is that it comes at a much higher cost per ton. Yeah, and we talk about numbers which is somewhere between 3 to 4 times as expensive as the regular bunker. And again, that is a cost factor which needs to be taken into consideration. So basically, I would say, to answer your question, that we don't come around some kind of global understanding and agreement. And what the EU has been doing recently, I think, is a very positive move, because what we are looking at is a scenario where we need front runners, where we need people who go ahead and increase the pace. And I do share what Lasse had said a bit earlier, that it will be necessary, or it will be naturally very difficult to get 139 or 140 nations on one boat, because we simply have different agendas. Yeah, that goes way beyond shipping, of course. But the point simply is, and you will probably remember that we had a positive solution finally agreed for the implementation of the sulfur challenge we had, which was then finally put into place back in 2020. Which I think was a positive move, and we simply need to follow that track, finding global solutions here. I think, honestly speaking, there is not this one simple answer, also to your question, but I think it takes a lot of ongoing effort. But what makes me positive in this regard is that we have some front runners here, also on the political stage. And so hopefully this is going to help to increase the pace for this positive development.
Thank you, Michael. And Lasse, I see you.
Yeah, I'm keen on chipping in. I mean, you asked who will pay. Let's not fool ourselves. Consumers will pay, period. Eventually, if you want a green, a carbon-free bread or a carbon-free car, you have to pay. The good news is that decarbonizing shipping has hardly no costs to the consumer. And we have done the calculations. I mean, we are not in the container business, so I think Michael can answer for that, but we are in the dry bulk business. So we have developed a vessel that can burn ammonia, and if you take the full cost of that vessel, for instance, to take grains out of South America into Europe and distribute it into bread, to move to zero emission freight will increase the price of bread with 0.5 cent. If you do the same on the BMW and the alumina that goes into that, it will be $5 increase, negligible to the consumer. However, the problem is not that. The problem is that for the importer of that grain or that aluminium, the price could be close as double, because on a business-to-business setting, these prices have big difference. That is why we need mechanisms regulating that market. That is why we need a cost on carbon, because it's really to enable the consumer to do what they want, buy green products at a very, very limited extra cost, but the market itself will not solve it, because carbons are so effective, they're so cheap, that there's a reason why we have depended on it for 100 years. So I think that's really the key message. The cost to society and consumer on decarbonizing shipping is close to zero. So that's not the big issue. And that is one of the main reasons why we need a price on carbon that makes sure that we equalize this in the value chain and makes it competitive to order zero emission vessels.
Thank you, Lasse. And well, I'm sure that for the audience, the positions you both take raise some questions. So I'd like to look now at some of the questions that already have been put forward. The first question actually is for Peter, and that is, how can we promote the fact that huge externally audited registries exist and are where credible offsets are sourced from? What's your perspective on that, Peter?
Thank you, Dagmar. Well, our mission is to create even more awareness that is critical to offset remaining emissions according to higher standards and benefits for the SDGs. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello?
Yes, please continue, Peter. We can hear you.
Okay, could you hear my answer? I'm not sure. Could you? I can't see the question anymore. Could you give me a?
The question is how can we promote the fact that huge externally audited registries exist and are where credible offsets are sourced from?
Well, to promote the fact that huge externally audited registers exist, the question just to do in coordination with the compensation partners to offer a wide range of high quality offset projects, yeah, and follow up that by monitoring it carefully, that will solve the problem, I think.
Thank you, Peter. There's a wider question that all of you perhaps may have a view about, which is about the role of ports in decarbonizing shipping. We didn't touch upon that yet in the discussion before, so it'd be really good to hear what you see as an opportunity in that space. Who would like to take that? Lasse?
I can start, but I'm sure Michael has even more input on that, as they are pushing much more to ports than we are. But I think, yes, ports have a very important part in the transition. In the short term, to drive energy efficiency, as we discussed earlier on, to make sure that you put requirements on the carbon footprint of vessels coming into your port, differentiating on port fees, whatever, on carbon footprint. Second, to start making available fuels in the port, of course, which is an absolute necessity to move this forward. And three, to take an active part in these green corridors, being an integral part of aggregation of demand and supply for zero emission vessels. That would also should have some incentives in the ports and make sure that the fuels are available in the ports. So I think in this context, ports are a big enabler, actually, of both short and long-term carbon efficiency in shipping.
Thank you. I don't know, Michael or panels. Yeah, panels, I see you raise your hand, please.
Yeah, maybe just quickly to add to what Lasse was just saying, the component of onshore power supply. That's something that is quite developed in Europe. And to some degree in the United States, but is an opportunity for also the rest of the world, and something that can add to decarbonization, especially in some types of vessels. So lots to do in ports, yeah.
Thank you. Michael, I see you demuted, so you probably have a perspective as well.
Yeah, sure. We are again, indirectly involved when it comes to the port roles, but of course it is part of our supply chain. So we do get involved in a lot of discussions. I was actually attending just this week two major meetings of the port cities of Bremen/Bremerhaven and Hamburg, where they are also very much involved in these discussions. Well, basically, I think what we need to try to avoid is this chicken and egg scenario. The ports are, of course, very closely watching what the shipping lines, their customers, are doing in terms of the new technologies. And maybe to just pick on the example which Panos had mentioned in the beginning on LNG, yeah? Whatever the opinion on LNG might be, but fact is that, for instance, 2 of the top 5 shipping lines in the world are actively promoting the LNG technology, whereas another major shipping line, actually the #1 in the world, is definitely not supporting that technology, but is going in terms of e-fuel. And you can imagine that providing the capacity for respective bunkering or storage, talking about LNG, and other things, the ports at the end of the day need to have an idea where to invest and how to invest. That, like to mention one example, ammonia is one of the possible future technologies for us, or fuel types for us, but it also comes with a lot of restriction in terms of safety, for instance. So all these things need to be considered when, like, a big terminal port operator wants to make up their mind in which direction to go. Right now, there is no clear direction where to go on a big scale.
And Michael, you raise a very important point. One of our colleagues who's based in New Jersey always says that the port there would never go for ammonia because they would feel that there are too many safety issues involved. And so it shows that that has got to be a very holistic discussion, looking at all angles in terms of contributing to a sustainable way forward, and where ports can help this agenda. We've got a few more minutes left, and so perhaps we can try one more question, and that is about some very recent announcements that were made for corporates like Amazon and IKEA, because that suggests that ambitious cargo owners also want to see a decarbonization of their maritime freight by 2040. And how significant do you think that is for the industry? Lasse, what do you think?
No, I mean, that is absolutely significant. And I think, again, business is ahead of regulators on this. Business will be driving this, and you will see it starting in some areas and then in some corridors and so on. So I think that's very important. And I think that's really the problem, though, is the structure of this business is that for IKEA to decarbonize, they need to decarbonize most container vessels in the world, because they have one container on most of them, right? So they cannot decarbonize container by container or vessel by vessel. So we need also to have business model innovation in this context. And I think there is a lot to learn from the power industry, where you have the green certificates or certificate origin or whatever you call it. So for IKEA to be 100% decarbonized by 2040, they have two choices. One is to make sure that all vessels in the world, more or less, with an IKEA container on board are decarbonized, or we need to create some kind of a market where they can make sure that there are a fleet of vessels serving the world with zero emission fuels that in total amounts to the amount of freight that IKEA needs. And we certainly in Klaveness believe of the latter. We don't think it's possible to decarbonize everything at the same time and in parallel. So that requirement of 2040 actually will drive investments in vessels earlier, but it will not be dedicated vessels, because that's simply not possible for a company of that size. So very positive, and it will not only drive decarbonization, but also have to redefine how business models are set up in our industry.
Thank you, Lasse. And I will now draw this to an end. We touched on a lot of topics, international level, the work the EU is doing, the question of funding, also the opportunity of voluntary credit systems. We could talk on about this for a lot longer. I just want to thank you all for your contribution to this discussion. I hope we can further follow this up, because there are definitely some really good ideas just in this virtual room. So when we have a wider discussion, surely we must be able to push this agenda in the right direction. So thanks a lot. Thank you also to the European Union team to giving us the time to discuss this issue. And all have a good day, either in Glasgow or virtually.
Thank you, Dagmar. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.